During this last week of March 1934, troops bearing a foreign uniform have been drilling in 19 American cities. Hitlerism has invaded America.
In 1935, Sinclair Lewis, the acclaimed chronicler of American middle-class mores and manners, published the novel It Can't Happen Here, a cautionary tale of right-wing populism and anti-intellectual politicking in the United States, deep in the throes of economic catastrophe with an eye on the rising fascist tide on the European continent. Lewis's bit of speculative fiction was propelled forward by a strongman named Berzelius Buzz Windrip, who defeats Franklin Roosevelt in the 1936 presidential election and quickly consolidates power into an autocratic regime. When the novel hit the shelves, it became a bestseller almost immediately, and much of the critical commentary that appeared at the time was fixated on who the real-life inspiration for Windrip might have been. The obvious parallels in both personality and demagogue status to Louisiana Governor Huey Long were impossible to ignore. There was another comparison, however, that many journalists at the time drew to a person much less familiar to today's viewers. William Dudley Pelley, founder of the Silver Legion of America, a nascent paramilitary organization promoting its own brand of apple pie and Christianity fascism. Dudley and his silver shirts were the closest the United States ever came to having homegrown nativist Nazi stormtroopers, ready to usher in a new era of mythic racialism and violent, purifying bigotry. Pelley was born in Lynn, Massachusetts, in the last decade of the 19th century.
His father, William G.A. Pelley, was a newspaper reporter and also a minister, which are sort of the two fields that William Dudley went into. And so he certainly patterned, I think, a lot of his adult life professionally on following his father, who would have been relatively conservative politically himself.
And Pelley was nothing if not precocious. By the age of 12, he had purchased a hand press and began publishing a periodical of local interest to distribute to his grammar school peers. But there was very little in his early life to suggest the frightening and toxic politics with which he would eventually make his name.
There's no real evidence of any sort of contact with anti-Semitism as a small child, but Pelley was growing up in New England in the late 19th century during a period where the new immigrants are coming in from Eastern and Southern Europe who were overwhelmingly Catholic and Jewish, and you see a lot of anti-Semitism, a lot of nativism spring up in response to those immigrants. So he certainly would have been exposed to it in the environment that he was living in New England during the late 19th, early 20th centuries.
As a young man in his 20s, Pelley had varying degrees of success selling short works of fiction to both pulp and literary magazines, and even managed to win 2 O. Henry Awards. But ultimately, he found the pay not steady enough to raise a family, and turned to screenwriting to pay the bills. Alongside other literary figures with stars and dollar signs in their eyes, Pelley headed to Los Angeles in 1920, where he struck up a friendship with silent film star Lon Chaney. Pelley earned writing credits on 16 films during his 7 years in Hollywood, including 2 of Chaney's pictures, The Light in the Dark and The Shot. Chaney biographer Michael F. Blake wrote in his book A Thousand Faces, quote, "While Pelley maintained that he and Chaney remained friends until the actor's death, it is obvious that the friendship between the two had cooled by 1928, when Pelley fell into disfavor with publishing in Hollywood circles. During his stay on the West Coast, spiritualism, a belief system which encouraged active communication between the living and the dead, was experiencing a surge of popularity, and Pelley began making deep connections within the subculture. It was when his talent for writing converged with his new interest in mysticism that Pelley became something close to a household name to the American public. In March 1929, the American Magazine, a periodical with a circulation of close to 2 million, ran an article by Pelley titled 7 Minutes in Eternity, The Amazing Experience That Made Me Over. The autobiographical piece described a bizarre, hallucinatory, near-death experience wherein angelic men dressed in white, whom he would come to call his spiritual mentors, whispered the metaphysical secrets of the cosmos directly into his mind.
And so he has a bungalow that he lives in by himself, and he claims that one night he had this vision and journey by ascended masters that took him to higher planes of existence and explained to him then that there are these various planes of existence, that there's this reincarnation system where souls come back as superior beings, and that this was the real, true form of religion, and that all existing forms of religion have borrowed pieces of this, but none of them have got it completely correct, and that he is the sort of chosen master on this plane of existence to bring this message to humanity.
The dark side of Pelley's inner journey began when the teachings from this higher realm included visions which revealed to him the true nature of humanity's constituent parts and the divine hierarchy of the races. To the modern reader, such juxtaposition may seem stark, or at least unlikely, but one has to remember that the histories of fascism and the occult in the West are very much intertwined. High-ranking Nazis and members of Mussolini's fascist party were obsessed with ancient European magic and pagan legends of sorcery and mythical bloodlines. Pelley, however, never fully abandoned Christianity and managed to reconcile the Christ figure with his mystical visions. Pelley wasn't the only notable American man of letters seduced by all of this. Some historians have traced the anti-Semitic thought of modernist poet Ezra Pound back to a correspondence with fellow poetry scholar Louis Zukofsky, where William Pelley himself is named as a personal influence. Pelley's political ambitions were a glimmer in his unconscious psyche when he made his way to the mountains of western North Carolina in 1930 to establish an institution of higher learning devoted to metaphysics. This was realized for a few successful years under the banner of Galahad College, the physical campus of which was located near downtown Asheville. While North Carolina may have seemed a less than ideal place for the flourishing of such subterranean religious movements, but we shouldn't forget that the same year Pelley arrived in Asheville, about 4 hours to the east, Professor J.B. Rhine was performing some of the first parapsychology studies into the nature and veracity of extrasensory perception at Duke University in Durham. And a little closer to Asheville was Black Mountain College, where a group of young poets under the tutelage of masters Charles Olson and Robert Duncan were pushing the boundaries of the art form in new directions. Duncan himself claimed to be deeply influenced by theosophy and spiritualism. Galahad College was never supposed to be a research institute per se, but an eclectic series of lectures supplemented with Pelley's own publications, including his new magazine, Liberation. The college, however, was destined to be a short-term project, and Pelley's interest began to shift away from spiritualism and metaphysics proper to something more political and something much more sinister.
He attempts, at least, to integrate his anti-Semitism and those extremist political beliefs into a spiritual system. And that doesn't really work very well. And it's really at that point that he decides to sort of branch them off into two separate programs, where he has the religious teachings of liberation doctrine, and he has followers who read his spiritualist teachings. And then he also has the Silver Shirt Legion for his political message.
Pelley was closely following the rise of the Nazi Party in Germany throughout the early 1930s and viewed the event as the realization of a prophecy foreseen in one of his celestial visits from his spiritual mentors. Pelley's anti-Semitism and racial bigotry, which had been simmering beneath the surface, now flowed out of him in a stream of erudite bile. The Nazi Party became his primary model for a new organization he planned to remake from the ashes of Galahad College and his publishing house in Asheville. What Pelley envisioned was a national paramilitary organization, complete with a multi-chapter bureaucracy known as the Silver Legion of America, which he officially founded the day after Hitler was appointed chancellor by President Hindenburg. The members wore uniforms consisting of a silver shirt and tie, a campaign cap, and blue corduroy trousers. It wasn't long before the rank and file of the Legion adopted fascist nomenclature and were nicknamed the Silver Shirts. As membership in the Silver Legion grew, Pelley's anti-Semitism came to the forefront of the group's ideology. The conspiratorial narrative Pelley constructed in various publications saw international Jewry as having completely infiltrated the political economy of the United States. In 1933, a Silver Shirt cell based in Salt Lake City, Utah, abducted and assaulted a communist sympathizer, beating him within an inch of his life. Pelley had his first brush with the forces of antagonistic state power when North Carolina charged him with financial fraud under its Blue Sky Law in 1934, after it was determined that he sold a substantial amount of unregistered stock, although the arrest was likely politically motivated. He was given a suspended 2-year sentence and was forced to pay a fine. Later that same year, an unknown party targeted a Silver Legion bookshop for an after-hours brick attack. Much like his possible fictional counterpart, Buzz Windrip, Pelley ran for president on a third-party ticket in 1936. The Silver Legion talking points portrayed him as the only candidate uncorrupted by Judeo-Bolshevik influence. Only Washington State, home to one of the largest Legion chapters, allowed his name to actually appear on the ballot. He received under 2,000 actual votes, then proceeded to accuse a cabal of Jews of tampering with voting machines. The March 6, 1939 issue of Life magazine ran a piece titled Fascism in America, which profiled a number of far-right organizations and high-profile Nazi sympathizers, including Pelley, and is worth quoting at length here. Quote, "Here in small Chehalis, Washington, population 4,900, is the other and far more serious side of the American fascist picture presented by the Nazi bully boys at their Bund meetings in New York. Here are no guttural-voiced hyphenated Americans, but simple folk of the kind to be found in any American small town. Depression worried about their jobs and businesses, groping for something to fight back at in the bewildering, swift-changing world, they are easy meat for William Dudley Pelley's silver shirt organizers and propaganda. Losing their faith in democracy, they bowed to the arrogant fascist communist assertion that America's only choice is between fascism and communism." End quote. In May 1938, Congress created the House Un-American Activities Committee under the chairmanship of Texas Democratic Representative Martin Dees Jr. to investigate any subversive activities on the part of American citizens. In 1940, the committee identified the Silver Shirts as, quote, "the largest, best financed, and certainly the best published of all the domestic fascist organizations." Throughout the 1930s, Pelley and his legion were able to operate in an atmosphere of free speech tolerance. Once the United States entered the war in 1942, attitudes towards right-wing and proto-fascist groups shifted dramatically. In April of that year, Roosevelt gave the green light to Hoover's FBI to infiltrate and dismantle the Silver Legion.
And so exact numbers for the Silver Shirt Legion are really impossible to determine. Probably 10,000 people maybe were members. He frequently talked about what he called his actionist boys, who were the sort of stormtroopers of the Silver Shirt Legion. And there was a branch in Southern California, in San Diego, that did try to get weapons out of a munitions depot.
William Dudley Pelley was tried and convicted of 11 counts of sedition and sent to federal prison for a term of 15 years. Upon his release on parole in 1950, he continued to write on topics channeled directly from those angelic super beings that initially spurred him on decades before. He even got caught up in the flying saucer craze and other mid-century paranormal phenomena. The true, long-lasting legacy of the Legion was the inspiration it gave to later extreme right-wing hate groups, who did a surprising amount of damage in their own right. The most infamous example of this intellectual pedigree is the life and work of Henry L. Beach, a former Silver Legion chapter leader who went on to form the violent white separatist organization Posse Comitatus, which made headlines in 1983 after a shootout with federal marshals that left 2 agents dead.